残酷な天使のように少年よ神話になる青い風が今胸のドアを叩いても私だけをただ見つめて微笑んでるあなたそっと触れるもの求めることに夢中で運命さえまだ知らない痛いけな瞳だけどいつか気づくでしょうその背中には未来目指すための羽があること残酷な天使の手で窓辺からやがて飛び立つほとばしる熱いパトスで思い出を裏切るならこの空を抱いて輝く少年よ神話になれ
As has been the case since the before times, we start with our COVID-19 update. Here are the current confirmed cases and deaths as of the last day of editing, with our regular podium position remaining unchanged. With this in mind, the world did however pass some new and exciting milestones. The United Kingdom passed Russia to take the number 4 spot for the most confirmed infections, although at this stage in the race, it seems very unlikely that the top 3 spots will ever be dethroned. The United States on the other hand crossed the 750,000 deaths threshold, making its effects in the US roughly 250 times more deadly than 9/11. For the world as a whole, November also marked the 5 million death threshold, meaning by some estimates, COVID-19 is now more deadly than the Napoleonic Wars. However, not every milestone was bad, as the nations of Singapore and the United Arab Emirates both claimed the 90% vaccination Xbox achievement, while Cuba, Portugal, and Chile follow closely behind. The 26th United Nations Climate Conference was held this month in Glasgow, Scotland, in which 25,000 delegates across 200 countries attended. A whole 120 heads of state were present at the event, as well as other notable figures including Prince Charles, Bill Gates, and 503 representatives from the fossil fuel industry. To understand why this year was so significant, we'll have to turn the clock back a few short years. In 2015, the annual climate conference was held in France, which led to 194 states to sign the Paris Climate Agreement, who collectively made up over 98% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The aim of the agreement was to commit to a plan of climate change mitigation, the adoption of greener policies, and the financing of the monumental task of mitigating the effects of climate change. The long-term goal would be to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels, but much more preferably below 1.5 degrees, a milestone where shit really starts hitting the fan. Ideally, the end goal is to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2050, after which, the Earth would slowly start to reverse the damage already inflicted. The way the Paris Climate Agreement was designed is that although there would continue to be a conference every year, countries would only be expected to renew and set further goals every 5 years, which for those keeping track at home, would have been in 2020. The reason for the postponement, to no one's surprise, was due to COVID-19. However, as commentators have pointed out, this gave the international community time to respond to the outcome of the US election. This was because, although President Trump had full intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, no nation was allowed to officially withdraw until only a few days after the US election would be decided. As the US is the second largest emitter in the world, this wouldn't have been an insignificant change. There are of course a million things we could mention about this incredibly important 2-week conference, but in an attempt to live up to our name, let's just look at the highlights. China and the United States, usually seen as two global rivals, vowed to boost climate cooperation overall, in which they would work together to limit that all-important 1.5 degree temperature rise. President of the Asia Society and former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, called the agreement a big step forward, but stressed that it wasn't the type of game-changing agreement that the world as a whole might have hoped for. India was one of the most controversial nations at the event, owing to their last-minute watering down of the final deal, pledging that they would phase down coal, as opposed to phase it out. China had reportedly pushed for similar language to be used. However, it's been speculated that the announcement was left to India alone, as it would be seen as more palatable without Chinese involvement. From the perspective of India and many other developing nations, phasing out fossil fuels is viewed as an incredibly expensive venture for a problem it only recently started contributing towards. From their perspective, developed countries use these same fossil fuels to build up their nations and supercharge their economies, and only now, when the damage has already been done, they expect less developed regions to rebuild their already underdeveloped energy infrastructure to solve a problem they did very little to create. Coal currently powers 70% of India's energy needs, but that doesn't mean it isn't transitioning to renewables at a breakneck rate, with the government aiming to produce 50% of its energy needs from renewable energy by the end of the decade. India has currently pledged to achieve net zero emissions by the year 2070, 20 years behind the ideal 2050 goal. The most fucking embarrassing country in attendance was Australia, who literally committed to a net zero emissions target at the very last minute, despite having no fucking plan to actually achieve it. Australia slipped to last place in terms of climate policy in the latest Climate Change Performance Index, somehow ranking behind the likes of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Brazil, the latter of which literally has a leader who thought the COVID vaccine had the capacity to turn people into crocodiles. Australia as a nation is perhaps the strangest outlier when it comes to its energy and environmental policies as a whole, as it both has everything to lose and such a ridiculous amount to gain. However, there's a reason its government is often criticized as being owned by a collection of mining companies. The most baffling part about Australia's inaction is that it's very likely going to be fucked over especially hard if these climate targets aren't met. At the start of last year, it experienced a bushfire larger than the entire nation of Syria. Its Great Barrier Reef has lost more than half its coral in just 26 years. And if the world does not indeed stop warming at the 1.5 degree threshold, Australia will be a particular place of interest for potentially millions of displaced refugees. It's not as if the nation doesn't have the means to set itself up as a beacon of green energy either, as transitioning to renewable energy like solar just needs a metric fuck ton of space and a metric fuck ton of sun, something that isn't exactly in short supply by having an entire desert continent to work around. In fact, there's even an entire state that sometimes produces too much electricity from wind and solar sources, which has been made more favorable with batteries they borrowed from Elon Musk. Critics will point out that coal generates $50 billion a year for the Australian economy, which isn't an insignificant amount of money, but diversification would be much easier than clinging desperately onto a dying industry. As it currently stands, the country is losing billions of dollars from entrepreneurs having to move overseas, owing to the nation's dogshit policies toward innovation. And as any economist will tell you, not diversifying from the profits of natural resources is one of the dumbest fucking things a country can do. At this point, we should probably remind viewers that Prime Minister Scott Morrison is most famous for shitting himself in Engadine McDonald's in 1997, an event which is celebrated with a special plaque to his achievements. The 26th United Nations Climate Conference as a whole was not nearly as disappointing as Australia, however, with a variety of significant commitments being signed along the way. More than 130 countries pledged to halt and reverse deforestation, over 100 more signed to cut methane emissions by 30% over the next decade, and over 30 countries have pledged to ban the use of petrol-powered cars by the year 2035. The event was seen as far from the saving throw that it was hoped before the conference, but it does serve as a small, but still significant step in the right direction. In the middle of November, Russia used a ground-based missile to destroy one of its own satellites in what was later discovered to be a test in its anti-satellite technology. NASA was understandably fucking furious with the weapons demonstration, as it would later report that over 1,500 trackable pieces of debris from the event were still floating around in orbit, and several thousand more that are too small to identify. There's a few reasons NASA would be so angry about Russia blowing up their own satellite, but the biggest reason is that it forced the International Space Station to close the hatches to various modules and shelter in place past the debris field, a process made harder as it only takes around 90 minutes to complete a full orbit of the Earth. The reason this is so terrifying is that because the International Space Station travels at 28,000 kilometers an hour, or 7.6 kilometers a second, even flecks of paint or tiny screws can inflict astronomical damage to the ISS as a whole. Commentators in the space community have universally called the weapons test reckless, which is made even more abhorrent by the fact that the ISS is currently housing 2 Russian cosmonauts. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson had this to say about the event: "I'm outraged by this irresponsible and destabilizing action. With its long and storied history in human spaceflight, it is unthinkable that Russia would endanger not only the American and international partner astronauts on the ISS, but also their own cosmonauts." NASA and other space agencies have become increasingly worried about the growing level of space junk orbiting Earth, of which right now there are more than 100 million pieces larger than a millimeter flying around the planet at incredible speeds. This has become a problem that proves to be incredibly difficult to solve, and in extreme cases may even have the potential to lock humanity in a cage of its own garbage. Of course, there's also the military implication of such a test. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty bans the use of all weapons of mass destruction and military installations in outer space, and although blowing up your own satellites in a test doesn't appear to be breaking any agreements, it wouldn't be hard to count it in a serious gray area. On this topic, a spokesperson for the US State Department had this to say: "Russia's dangerous and irresponsible behavior jeopardizes the long-term sustainability of our space and clearly demonstrates that Russia's claims of opposing the weaponization of space are disingenuous and hypocritical. Warfare in space is about as terrifying as it sounds, with one concept developed during the Cold War, called Project Thor, would have satellites armed with 6-meter-long metal rods, which because of their extremely high speeds when falling from orbit, could create an impact comparable to a small nuclear bomb, with kinetic force alone. Perhaps wishful thinking, but ideally, humanity's journey beyond its home planet would mark an end to its need to wage senseless and petty wars, when alternatively, working as a unified planet could usher in a new golden age for our species. If space war is half as bad as infinite warfare, I don't want anything to fucking do with it." A lot of the modern news cycle seems to be occupied by the United States and its internal affairs. However, we thought it might be fun to instead talk about the perception of the United States among the rest of the developed world. The Pew Research Center recently released data from over 18,500 respondents from 17 advanced economies, and so viewers don't have to read the 3,500 word report themselves. We'll do our best to talk about the most interesting parts. One of the most highly praised American achievement was in the field of technology, with most nations responding that they consider the United States to have the best or above average technology achievements when compared to anywhere else in the world. It was a similar story in terms of entertainment, with the vast majority of countries considering the US to be well above average in this regard. This trend continues among its military and universities, but does however see a sharp drop-off when examining citizen well-being, with standard of living seen as around average, while its healthcare system was rated by most as either the worst or below average in the developed world. For a nation that markets itself as the land of the free, this perception also seems to be shared among its international peers, with more people than not believing that the US government respects the personal freedoms of its citizens. Quite interestingly, a pretty universal belief was that the United States had a serious discrimination issue, while US citizens themselves were the least likely to believe there were such problems. Fascinatingly, the perception of discrimination within the United States was heavily correlated with a person's political leaning, which seemed to remain pretty consistent across the globe. Another interesting finding were that respondents appeared to have a more favorable view of the United States under Joe Biden when compared to President Trump. However, this appears to be more complicated domestically, with Biden currently facing only a 41% approval rating. It's important to know that the survey was light on details about exactly why respondents gave the answers they did. However, with an increasingly polarized world, where people are seemingly divided on the most inconsequential of issues, perhaps just providing the data is a more favorable way of reporting. As always, viewers who wish to see a link to our list of sources can find it in the description. With this in mind, viewers who might want to rig the next survey to push their own personal agenda might be interested in today's sponsor. If you're trying to remain invisible online, or just trying to watch region-locked content, then you'll probably want a VPN. Surfshark VPN makes protecting your online privacy and watching prohibited Netflix shows easier than conducting a military coup in Africa, and you can rest easy knowing that your privacy will be infinitely more secure than the Sudanese government. Gone are the days of having to pay child labor to recreate a sock puppet rendition of The Godfather. Simply change your location to anywhere you like and appreciate a whole cornucopia of new media to enjoy. Signing up with the code on screen will give viewers an 83% discount, 4 months for free, and viewers who aren't 100% satisfied can back out in the first 30 days and get a full refund. Surfshark VPN, it's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, the European Union sues itself. The guy who thought COVID vaccines could turn people into crocodiles awards himself a Medal of Scientific Merit, and a man attempting to escape a swarm of bees jumps in a lake to be eaten by piranhas. As viewers will likely know, we like to reserve stories on this series for topics we find to be the most important and impactful over the month. However, we do make exceptions if they are really fucking funny. Viewers may remember our previous coverage on QAnon, the online cult based around the conspiracy theory that a network of satanic cannibalistic pedophiles are operating a global child sex trafficking ring, who supposedly conspired against President Donald Trump during his time in office. As fucking insane as this is, members of the group went on to outdo themselves this month, when on the 2nd of November, hundreds met in Dallas, Texas, where President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. The eager crowd was gathered expecting to see the resurrection of President Kennedy's son, a man who unfortunately died in a plane crash in 1999, and as a supposed prophecy foretold, the former president's deceased son would then announce how he intends to run as the vice president, alongside Donald Trump in 2024. Other members believe that President Kennedy himself would also be resurrected, before proclaiming President Trump to be the divine king of kings. As expected, no one was resurrected in the state of Texas that day. However, reportedly some of the attendees were still at the site nearly a week after the event took place. The most incredible thing of all was that this wasn't necessarily the most insane claim by members of the group in recent years, such as multiple failed predictions that Mark Zuckerberg would be forced to flee the United States entirely, the accusation that German Chancellor Angela Merkel is Hitler's granddaughter, and even an allegation from a US politician that a 2018 California wildfire was caused by a Jewish space laser. Perhaps the most famous member of the QAnon movement is a man by the name of Jake Angeli, who you might remember as the Age of Empires unit, who took an unscheduled tour of the US Capitol in January this year, and only this month was sentenced to 41 months in prison. Although we suspect people in the QAnon cult very likely get their news from closely cross-referencing animal entrails, it's worth mentioning that as hilarious as this is, the entire structure of this conspiracy theory is held together by the fact that its followers expect to be called stupid. The cult creates a self-sustaining community of people who feel as if they are part of something much larger and more important than themselves, while warranted criticism from people around them drives them deeper into a lonely void, unable to accept that they were fooled by an internet prank gone way out of control. At the end of the day, these people are some of the most tragic victims of disinformation that an endless supply of online echo chambers have produced, a problem only destined to get worse, as a handful of algorithms find it more profitable to gradually divide society than to just filter out such blatantly obvious bullshit. Our next story takes us to the not so magical land of Belarus, often called the last dictatorship in Europe. Regular viewers might remember our previous coverage of the nation, when in August last year, President Alexander Lukashenko, more widely recognized as Harry Potter's uncle, rigged the absolute fuck out of the nation's elections, giving himself 80% of the vote. The aftermath of the pretend election led to a shit ton of protesters getting arrested, nearly all opposition leadership being kidnapped or forced into exile, and more international sanctions than you could wave a stick at. After a year of complaining that they were being punished for being absolute pieces of shit, the Belarus leadership came up with a brilliant idea. Instead of even attempting to stand up militarily against the entire European Union, it would instead weaponize immigration. Here's how it worked. State-owned travel agencies, helped by the government's own airline, would start ramping up flights from regions in the Middle East directly to Belarus for a discounted price. These tourists would then be given Belarusian visas before being rounded up and sent across into neighboring countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, armed with wire cutters and a few €1,000. Most of these migrants would attempt to make it to a nice European nation like Germany, where they could request asylum, while many others would be caught in between these borders, where Poland would refuse to let them pass, and Belarus would refuse to take them back. This has created something of a humanitarian crisis, where migrants are caught between returning to their old lives in the Middle East and being able to seek asylum somewhere in Europe, a situation that experts are calling Iraq and a hard place. All joking aside, at least 13 people have died in such migrant camps as of time of writing, with Polish officials not allowing doctors, journalists, or NGOs to help those stuck at the border. This isn't to say that Belarus isn't giving migrants a special kind of aid. However, instead of the much needed tents and food, they are supposedly being supplied with tear gas to fight against Polish authorities. To make their actions even easier to demonize, there's even footage of Belarus troops using lasers and strobe lights in an attempt to blind Polish guards at the border, which could very well be considered a war crime, depending on who you ask. In terms of international reactions, Poland has approved a €350 million plan to build a 60-kilometer wall at the Belarus border, while 12 other European governments have sent their own support officers to reinforce the borders of Latvia and Lithuania. Belarus itself has threatened to cut off the gas pipeline, which runs from Russia into Europe. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed that he doesn't believe this will happen. The European Union, on the other hand, has been drafting the mother of all sanction plans, which is expected to target people connected with Alexander Lukashenko, as well as state-owned enterprises that helped assist in the migrant crisis. The most insane part of this entire situation is that many speculate that it was orchestrated in an attempt to shift attention away from the torture, oppression, and human rights violations within Belarus itself. When considering we wouldn't have mentioned it at all if it wasn't for their stupid fucking plan, you have to wonder how a head of state could be such a fucking idiot. As of time of writing, it's currently unclear how this crisis is likely to end, and the fate of the still trapped migrants still hangs in the balance. We now return to a military coup close to our hearts, which is of course the one in Myanmar. To get viewers up to speed, the nation was taken over in February this year after its military faction was voted less popular than a pile of shit in their general elections, after which it decided to double down on its unpopularity and take the entire country by force. The nation has been flirting with a full-scale civil war ever since. However, so far, the country has been riddled with armed resistance movements, military retaliation, and enough war crimes to make Darth Vader tell you to chill the fuck out. Myanmar would make headlines in the Western sphere this month when it reported that a US journalist by the name of Danny Fenster was arrested for charges of sedition, terrorism, and wearing cargo jorts. As these charges were entirely made up, Mr. Fenster didn't end up serving the 11 years in prison he had been promised, but rather, his release was negotiated by the US government after less than 2 weeks of incarceration. This coincides with the ongoing trial of Aung San Suu Kyi, the woman who won the election at the end of 2020 and is currently facing an unfathomable amount of prison time. With this in mind, it's hardly the first time she's been detained in the name of democracy, and her Wikipedia page has an entire section dedicated to the years she's been arrested and incarcerated for extended periods of time. Meanwhile, the illegitimate leader of the country, Funny Had Man, was busy with his own project, as at the tail end of October, government troops fired artillery into the Chin State town of Than Lang, in retaliation of an early attack that had reportedly killed around 30 soldiers. 160 homes were destroyed in the resulting blaze, forcing around 8,000 of the town's residents to flee. A disinformation campaign later claimed that the townspeople purposely burned down their own houses. However, this was later disproven by the fact that no one could seriously be that fucking stupid to believe such bullshit. It is expected that with the military coup, combined with the complete mismanagement of COVID-19, Myanmar will have lost 17 years of development since the takeover in February, and by next year, it's expected that half the country will be forced into poverty. A story too late to cover last month was the military takeover of Sudan, which, for those keeping track at home, marks the 5th such coup in Africa in the last 14 months, making the nation eligible for a golden Kalashnikov rifle for its achievement. On October 25th, a man by the name of Abdel Fattah al-Burhan seized the government at the head of the Sudanese military before having now former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok arrested, deposed, and forced to play Dark Souls 3 with a Wii remote. The funny thing about the whole situation is that it hasn't even been that long since the nation's last fucking coup, as in 2019, Sudan started its transition into a democracy after overthrowing some other alleged war criminal you've probably never heard of. Unfortunately, the instability of the 2019 overthrow, compounded by COVID-19 related complications, would lead to soaring inflation, sky-high food prices, and a shit ton of Sudanese people pissed off at the government. This is why, when the coup at the end of October took place, many citizens showed open support for the military takeover, because although the hope of democracy was dead in the water, things probably couldn't get much worse. This isn't to be confused with the attempted coup in September, which we couldn't even verify was at all related to what's going on now. The place is a fucking mess. In terms of the international reaction, the United States, European Union, and the African Union all condemned the coup, urging Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to return control to the now overthrown government. China has also expressed its condemnation. However, it tends to be more apathetic about these things and didn't expressly encourage the government to revert back to what it once was. Since the military takeover, 15 protesters have unfortunately been killed in the aftermath, while the United States government has cancelled $700 million in aid. Like pretty much every government overthrow we cover on this series, the rest of the story could probably be written by an attentive chimp. Protesters seeking civilian representation in government are killed. Protests become more violent as a result. A state of emergency is declared, and this lasts until the unrest is over, or enough people are shot to get the message. Knowing the real details on the ground is currently quite difficult, as governments tend to cut off internet access in times of crisis. However, I wouldn't be betting on any form of democracy anytime soon. It seems for the people of Sudan, their best hope at such an alien form of government is to wait another few months for the next guy to take over the country and impose their own new and unique form of authority to the region. Our next story concerns the election in Nicaragua, everyone's fourth favorite Central American/Caribbean nation. As you might have guessed, very rarely do we cover elections at all, unless some fuckery was afoot, and Nicaragua is no exception. But first, a fun lesson in history. From the mid to late 70s, Nicaragua was ruled by dictator Anastasio Somoza, up until a revolution which led to his overthrow in 1979. This is where we meet Daniel Ortega, the now current president of Nicaragua, who at the time was a resistance fighter, a young man who had gotten himself captured, tortured, and exiled to Cuba under the rule of Somoza. During his time in Cuba, Daniel Ortega would receive training from Fidel Castro's Marxist-Leninist government, and along with his brother, would go on to form a faction which would later assist in overthrowing Somoza's government. fast forward to 1984, and Daniel Ortega would win the Nicaraguan general election to become president, and would remain in his position until 1990, after which he would lose the next 3 elections. After 16 years, he would then be re-elected in 2006, and he wasn't about to leave another election up to chance. He began by dismantling all checks on his exercise of power, stacked the electoral council with people on his payroll, and started making use of all the fun things in the typical autocrat's toolbox. For a self-proclaimed communist, Daniel Ortega sure didn't like to share. We now come to the present day, where Mr. Ortega is still in charge, and as of November 7th, he has officially won his 5th general election with over 75% of the vote. Of course, democratic entities such as the United Kingdom, United States, and European Union have all called out Daniel Ortega on his obvious election fraud, while Venezuela, Russia, and Cuba, 3 countries we've previously covered for pretty much the same shit, have expressed their unconditional support. In terms of the other candidates in the election, the closest comparison we could make is that scene in The Incredibles, where the computer cycles through how many superheroes have been taken out or are currently missing in action. Daniel Ortega, now a man in his 70s, has spent his entire career in politics. He went from taking part in urban resistance movements, getting tortured by the government, being exiled into Cuba, trained to be a guerrilla fighter, before eventually sitting in the very same seat of power he once spent so long attempting to overthrow. With such a long time to reflect on the dictator he once sought to remove and the regime he fought so hard to topple, it's astounding that not once did he realize that he had become the very thing he once hated, and that he likely wouldn't have even been in power had it not been for this disdain in the first place. With the month of news concluded, it's time for our usual announcements. As you might have guessed, it's not every month we can announce a new series, a successful fundraiser, or an appearance of Rudy Giuliani, and to be entirely honest, November is nothing special. For the sake of our own sanity, December likely won't see nearly as many releases as November, but rest assured, there's a lot of cool shit in the pipeline. As we like to do every year, December's news will feature a survey, so we know what kinds of things people like, what new concepts people find interesting, and perhaps even things people are willing to leave behind. Along with this, we also plan to release what will likely be the most high-effort tier list anyone has ever made, and if all goes well, that should be dropping in the first half of December. As always, we'd like to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon, and viewers who want to watch our collection of exclusive content, or just help out what we do, can find the link in the description. Once again, on behalf of the entire team, we'd like to wish everyone a happy December of 2021.